The sun always seemed to shine a little brighter over Willow Creek. It was the kind of town where people still waved to passing cars, where neighbors dropped off casseroles, and where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least they thought they did. Among the town's familiar faces, none were more respected than Deputy Mark Jensen and his wife Laura. Together, they looked like the picture of stability, the couple everyone quietly envied. He, the strong and dependable lawman. She, the soft-spoken schoolteacher who remembered every child's birthday and never forgot to send a thank you card. On the surface, they were perfect. Every morning, Laura packed Mark's lunch and kissed him goodbye as he headed out in his crisp uniform, badge gleaming in the early light. Their 6-year-old son, Ethan, would run after his father's patrol car, waving until it turned the corner. It was an image straight out of a postcard, the kind people frame and keep on mantels. But behind that neat little picture was a truth that would soon shatter the town's peace. At school, Laura's laughter filled the halls. She had that rare ability to make every child feel safe and seen. Parents adored her, colleagues admired her, and students clung to her like she was family. But when the final bell rang and the children went home, the brightness in her eyes dimmed. She drove home slower these days, lingering in the parking lot long after the other teachers had left. She checked her phone before entering the house, deleted messages, erased call logs, and took deep breaths before stepping inside. Inside the Jensen home, everything was in order, perfectly arranged, meticulously clean. Mark liked it that way. He liked everything to be under control. Laura used to think it was just part of his training as a deputy, that attention to detail. But lately that order felt more like surveillance. If a cup was out of place, he noticed. If she changed her perfume, he asked why. If she laughed too loudly on the phone, his eyes narrowed. And yet when neighbors saw them together, Mark's arm around her waist, they called them the dream couple. Appearances mattered in Willow Creek, and Mark made sure theirs stayed flawless. Laura's friends had started noticing small things, the way she hesitated before answering personal questions, how she often covered her wrists with long sleeves even in warm weather. When asked, she'd smile and say she was just tired, just busy. But one evening, as her friend Megan walked her to her car after a late staff meeting, Laura's composure cracked. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with her keys. "If anything ever happens to me," she whispered, not meeting Megan's eyes, "tell them it wasn't an accident." Megan froze, confused, half thinking Laura was exaggerating. But the fear in Laura's voice didn't sound like drama. It sounded like truth. Back home, Mark was sitting in the living room, the TV volume low, eyes fixed on her as she entered. "You're late," he said flatly. Laura forced a smile, mumbling something about lesson plans. He didn't respond, just studied her, his jaw tight. Later that night, she heard him pacing in the hallway, the floorboards creaking in slow, deliberate rhythm. She lay still, pretending to sleep, her heart racing with every step. The next morning, Mark brought her coffee in bed, his mood suddenly gentle. "You've been stressed lately," he said, brushing her hair back. "You know I just want to take care of you, right?" His voice was calm, almost soothing, but underneath it lay something sharp, something that made Laura's stomach turn. She nodded, smiled, and thanked him. That's what she'd learned to do: smile, thank, obey. At Sunday service, they sat in the front row, holding hands as the pastor spoke about faith and family. Afterward, they mingled with other couples, laughing at small talk, complimenting each other like newlyweds. To anyone watching, they were an example of love and partnership. No one saw the tension in the way Laura's hand flinched when his fingers squeezed hers too tightly. No one heard the quiet arguments that filled their kitchen once the door closed. Mark had built his entire identity around being respected. He wasn't just a husband. He was the deputy, the man people called when they needed help. In a town like Willow Creek, image was everything, and losing control of that image terrified him. Laura, on the other hand, had begun to see through the cracks. She knew his smiles for the cameras, his kind words for the sheriff, his yes ma'ams to every neighbor. But she also knew the silence that followed whenever she tried to speak up at home. The moments when his temper flashed quick and cold. The apologies that never quite sounded sincere. One Friday evening, the Jensens hosted a backyard barbecue for Mark's colleagues. Laughter filled the air, music played softly, and Laura moved gracefully among the guests, refilling glasses and serving food. But when she passed behind Mark, a guest overheard his low voice, stern and clipped. "Keep smiling." The tone made her freeze for half a second before she nodded, lips trembling slightly, as she turned back toward the grill. To everyone else, it was just another happy gathering. To Laura, it was another performance, another night pretending she was safe. As dusk settled, Laura tucked Ethan into bed, reading him his favorite story. When he finally drifted off, she sat beside him, watching the rise and fall of his small chest. She thought about leaving. She'd even saved a few $100s, hidden away in a book he'd never open. But the thought of taking Ethan away, of facing Mark's wrath if he found out, froze her in place. She didn't want to believe he'd hurt her. Not really. He was a deputy. He protected people. He'd sworn an oath. Outside, crickets sang beneath the warm Missouri night, the kind of night that made the town feel peaceful and safe. Mark stood by the window, watching her through the glass, expression unreadable. From the street, if anyone passed by, they'd see what looked like a loving husband keeping watch over his family. No one would guess that behind that smile was a man losing control. 3 days later, the same quiet town would wake to shocking news. Laura Jensen, the beloved teacher, would be reported missing, and the man who once swore to protect her would become the prime suspect in her disappearance. It started with small cracks, barely noticeable to anyone but Laura. A missed smile. A cold silence where warmth used to be. Mark had always been controlling, but lately, his control had sharpened into something darker. He'd stopped pretending to be the charming husband when no one was around. The mask he wore in public, steady, polite, protective, was slipping away. And what Laura saw underneath terrified her. He began calling her at school multiple times a day, asking where she was, who she was with, when she'd be home. When she didn't answer fast enough, he'd show up at the front office in uniform, flashing his badge with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Just checking in," he'd tell the staff, who smiled awkwardly and went back to their work. But Laura could feel their glances, could feel her private life slowly turning into whispered gossip. At home, the tension grew thicker. One night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Mark accused her of hiding things from him. "You're distant," he said quietly, pacing the living room. "You've been talking to people behind my back." Laura tried to keep her voice steady, denying it, but every word she spoke seemed to make him angrier. He stopped pacing and looked at her in a way that made her skin crawl, like she was no longer his wife but his suspect. Later that week he apologized, buying her flowers and taking her out to dinner at their favorite restaurant downtown. For a brief moment she let herself believe maybe things could get better. But even then his eyes kept darting to her phone every time it buzzed. When she excused herself to the restroom, he checked her messages. When she returned, his smile had vanished. He never mentioned it, but that night he slept on the couch without a word. Laura started keeping a small voice recorder in her purse. It was an old model she'd borrowed from the school's supply room. She didn't know what she planned to do with it, only that she needed proof, something that could speak for her if she ever couldn't. The recordings began innocently, arguments about money, about dinner being late. But slowly, his words grew sharper, colder, filled with a quiet menace that made her hands shake. She never played them back. She didn't need to. The echoes stayed in her head. She confided in Megan one rainy afternoon, meeting her in a parked car behind the school gym. "He's changing," Laura whispered, staring out the windshield. "Or maybe he's always been like this and I'm just now seeing it." Megan reached for her hand, urging her to leave, to take Ethan and go to her sister's place 2 towns over. But Laura shook her head. "You don't understand," she said softly. "He's a deputy. Everyone knows him. If I disappear, they'll believe him, not me." The storm outside matched the storm inside her chest. She wanted to believe Mark could change, that the man she fell in love with was still in there somewhere beneath the uniform and the rage. But when she looked at him now, all she saw was control. Cold, calculated control. Meanwhile, at the sheriff's office, rumors began to circulate about Mark. A traffic stop complaint had been filed. Excessive force. A bar owner claimed Mark had gotten aggressive after a few drinks. Nothing official, but enough to make the sheriff pull him aside for a talk. Mark returned home that night quiet and distant. When Laura asked what was wrong, he said, "They're trying to turn people against me." Then his voice dropped low. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" She said no, of course not. But deep down she knew. His paranoia had found its target. Her. That night, while he showered, Laura opened the closet and pulled out a small duffel bag. She began packing. A few clothes for Ethan, a photo album, her journal, the little bit of money she'd saved. Her hands trembled as she zipped it up and slid it under the bed. She didn't have a plan yet, just a date circled in her mind. Friday. She'd leave after school when Mark was on patrol. But Mark was already watching her more closely than ever. He noticed her nervousness, the calls she took outside, the way she avoided his eyes. He'd begun checking her car mileage when she came home. He'd started reviewing her phone records through the county system. His control was tightening like a noose. 2 nights before she planned to leave, they had another argument. This one about something as small as a text from Megan that popped up on her phone. It spiraled fast. Mark slammed his hand against the counter, shattering a glass. Ethan came running in, crying. That stopped Mark cold. He looked at his son, then at Laura, and something flickered across his face, a mix of shame and fury. He walked out the door without a word, slamming it behind him. Laura stayed up that night staring at the broken glass. When she finally moved, she swept it up carefully, every shard reflecting fragments of her life, pieces she knew she could never put back together. The next day, she met her attorney secretly during lunch break, signing preliminary papers for divorce. She felt a strange mix of terror and relief, her hands shaking as she placed her signature on the page. "You're doing the right thing," the attorney told her. But Laura wasn't sure. Right didn't always mean safe. When she returned home that evening, Mark was already there, sitting in the dark. The only light came from the flicker of the television. "You're late again," he said softly. His tone wasn't angry this time, just eerily calm. "Where were you?" She lied, saying she had stayed after school with a student. He nodded slowly, eyes never leaving her face. "You know," he said, "you've been keeping secrets lately. I can feel it." She swallowed hard. "I'm just tired, Mark. That's all." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low and cold. "You should rest then. You'll need your strength." That night, Laura wrote a letter. She didn't finish it, just folded it and hid it in Ethan's storybook, the one they read every night. She kissed him goodnight and lingered there, brushing his hair gently. She whispered something he was too sleepy to understand. "No matter what happens, Mommy loves you." The next morning, Laura didn't show up at school. Her colleagues assumed she was sick. By evening, her car was found abandoned by the edge of a lake just outside town, the driver's door open, her purse still inside. At first, people thought maybe she'd had an accident, maybe she'd slipped. But Megan knew better. She remembered the words Laura had whispered weeks earlier, the ones that now echoed in her mind like a haunting refrain. "If anything ever happens to me, tell them it wasn't an accident." The news spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Deputy's wife missing. It was the kind of headline that stopped people in their tracks. How could someone like Laura Jensen, kind, gentle, loved by everyone, just vanish? And how could her husband, a man sworn to protect, not have the answers? Within hours, the sheriff's office turned into a command center. Search teams combed the nearby woods. Volunteers hung flyers, and the lake near where Laura's car was found became the center of attention. Mark Jensen was there from the start, organizing, directing, doing interviews. Cameras caught him standing by his patrol car, uniform crisp, eyes red from what appeared to be tears. "We're doing everything we can," he told the reporters. "Laura's my wife. I just want her home." To anyone watching, he was the grieving husband. But to Detective Sarah Whitmore, Something about his composure felt rehearsed. She had worked enough missing person cases to know that grief came in waves, messy, unpredictable. Mark's seemed calculated, every word perfectly timed. The first 48 hours brought no trace of Laura. Her phone was missing, but her purse and keys were found in the car. No signs of forced entry. No struggle visible. At least not at the scene. The sheriff's office ran through standard protocol, but with one of their own involved, things moved delicately. Too delicately. No one wanted to accuse a deputy without proof. But the whispers had already begun. Neighbors told detectives they had heard shouting from the Jensen house days before Laura disappeared. A cashier recalled seeing Laura looking pale and distracted the morning she vanished, buying snacks and water bottles. One detail stood out. She used cash, not her card, and seemed in a hurry. Detective Whitmore requested permission to search the Jensen home. Mark agreed without hesitation, even offering to walk them through the house himself. "You'll find nothing out of the ordinary," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He guided them from room to room, calm and cooperative. But when Whitmore knelt to inspect the living room carpet, her hand brushed something rough beneath the fibers, something that looked suspiciously like dried blood. She didn't say a word, not yet. Instead, she quietly marked it for forensic testing. The team later discovered traces of blood under a corner rug and along the edge of the baseboard. Too little to be visible at first glance, but enough to tell a story. The next day, detectives obtained a warrant for the property. They brought in luminol, and under the cold blue light the truth began to glow. Faint handprints, splatters, small but undeniable. Something violent had happened in that house. Mark was called in for questioning. The room was quiet, sterile, a camera blinking in the corner. "We're just trying to understand the timeline," Whitmore said, voice calm. "You said you last saw Laura leaving for school that morning?" Mark nodded. "She said she was running late. I kissed her goodbye. That was it." "And you didn't speak with her after that?" "No." His tone was flat now, his eyes on the table. Whitmore leaned forward. "Deputy, her car was found at the lake, 7 miles from your house. Why would she go there?" Mark exhaled slowly. Maybe she needed time to think. She'd been stressed. Stressed about what? He hesitated just a second too long. Work, family stuff. Whitmore studied him in silence. She'd seen it before. The subtle tightening of the jaw, the controlled breathing, the attempt to stay one step ahead. But beneath it, guilt pulsed like a hidden heartbeat. As the days passed, more cracks appeared in Mark's story. His phone records didn't match his statements. He claimed to be on patrol during the time Laura likely vanished, yet GPS data placed his vehicle near their home. Security footage from a nearby gas station caught his truck driving toward the lake that same afternoon, then returning hours later. The sheriff couldn't ignore it anymore. A man once trusted with the safety of the town was now under suspicion. But Mark wasn't the type to break easily. He doubled down, insisting he was being framed, that the department wanted to make him a scapegoat. Meanwhile, forensic results from the Jensen home confirmed the worst. The blood under the carpet belonged to Laura. A partial fingerprint on the rug matched Mark's right hand. Detectives began revisiting Laura's friends, hoping for context. That's when Megan came forward with the message Laura had sent 2 weeks earlier. The one that read, "If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident." Megan also mentioned the argument Laura had described the night before she vanished. Then came the breakthrough. During a detailed sweep of the Jensen property, officers uncovered a small box in the attic. Inside were Laura's missing cell phone, a flash drive, and a wedding ring. The phone was cracked but still recoverable. When investigators powered it up, they found several voice recordings saved under simple file names, A1, A2, A3. The recordings were chilling. Mark's voice, angry, controlling, accusing her of betrayal. Laura's voice, soft, shaking, pleading for calm. In one, Mark says, "If you ever try to leave me, Laura, I swear you'll regret it." In another, there's the sound of a door slamming, glass breaking, and Laura crying out. The recordings painted a picture no badge could protect. When investigators confronted Mark with the evidence, his composure began to fracture. He denied it all at first, said the recordings were out of context. But when they showed him the timestamp on the last file, recorded the night before Laura disappeared, he went silent. The pressure from the media intensified. The once respected deputy was now the face of betrayal. Former colleagues avoided his calls. The sheriff, who had known him for years, announced that Mark was being placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. Behind closed doors, detectives were preparing to charge him, but they still hadn't found Laura's body. Without it, the case was circumstantial, and Mark knew it. He smiled during his polygraph test, passed parts of it, and refused to crumble. "You have nothing," he told them during one late-night interrogation. "Nothing but stories." But a week later, on the 11th day of the search, a volunteer found something half-buried behind the Jensen property near the tree line. A torn piece of tarp, a hint of fabric. The smell hit first. Detectives rushed to the scene. As they dug carefully through the earth, the truth that had been buried for days finally surfaced. Wrapped in layers of plastic and tarp, they found the remains of Laura Jensen. The deputy who once vowed to protect and serve had become the monster he was sworn to stop. The town that once trusted Mark Jensen could hardly believe what they were seeing. The man in handcuffs, head bowed beneath flashing lights, wasn't the calm deputy they'd known for years. He was a murderer, accused of killing his own wife. The sight of him being led out of the sheriff's office sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. For weeks his face had been on every missing person flyer, every TV broadcast pleading for help. Now it was the face of betrayal. Reporters swarmed as officers escorted Mark to the patrol car. The same badge that once gave him authority now hung useless on his chest. "Deputy Jensen, did you kill your wife?" one shouted. He didn't respond. His jaw was set, his eyes dark and distant. Inside, he still believed he could control the story. After all, he'd always known how to manipulate appearances. The trial would take months to begin, but even in those early days, the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings from Laura's phone, the blood in the house, the lies in his alibi. Each detail painted a horrifying picture, a man so consumed by control and pride that he chose murder over losing face. Detective Whitmore testified about the discovery behind the Jensen property. She described finding Laura's body wrapped in tarp, her hands bruised from what looked like a struggle. The coroner's report confirmed what everyone feared. Laura had died from blunt force trauma to the head. Defensive wounds covered her arms. She had fought back. The final moments of her life were filled with terror and resistance. The prosecution argued that Mark's motive was simple: control. Laura had filed for divorce and he couldn't stand it. He was losing his grip, the district attorney told the jury. His career, his marriage, his image, it was all slipping away. And when men like Mark lose control, they don't just break, they destroy. In court, the recordings were played publicly for the first time. The room fell silent as Laura's voice filled the speakers, shaky, pleading, real. "Mark, please, not in front of Ethan." Then his voice, low and cold. "You made me do this. You pushed me too far." The audio cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of quiet sobs in the gallery. Even the jurors couldn't hide their horror. Mark's defense tried to paint a different picture. They argued that Laura had been unstable, that she provoked arguments, that her death was a tragic accident. But that narrative unraveled quickly. The forensic evidence told a story that couldn't be twisted. The pattern of the wounds, the timeline of her disappearance, the hidden phone, every piece fit perfectly into a puzzle of guilt. Megan, Laura's best friend, took the stand next. Her voice trembled as she recounted the last conversation they'd had. "She told me she was scared," Megan said, tears welling. "She said if anything happened to her, it wouldn't be an accident. She knew what he was capable of. She just didn't know how to escape." Then came the hardest testimony, the one that broke the courtroom. Ethan, just 6 years old, too young to fully understand, was asked gentle questions by the prosecution. Through his small, confused words, a picture emerged. He had heard shouting that night. "Mommy was crying," he said softly. "Daddy was mad." The room fell still. No one could breathe. Even Mark's mask cracked for a moment. His jaw clenched, his eyes glistened, not with regret but fury at being exposed. When the prosecution rested, there was no sympathy left for him. The once respected deputy had become a symbol of betrayal and abuse. Behind his badge, behind his authority, was a man driven by ego and fear. The defense tried one last desperate move, claiming temporary insanity, stress from years on the job, emotional breakdown. But the jury saw through it. They saw the pattern, the control, the manipulation. The recordings were enough to silence any doubt. The closing argument from the prosecution was quiet, deliberate, and devastating. He wore a uniform that stood for protection, but behind that badge he was a predator. Laura trusted him. She believed love could fix what fear had broken. But in the end, it was her faith in him that cost her life. When the jury filed back into the courtroom, the air felt thick. Every heartbeat echoed in silence. The foreperson stood, trembling slightly. We, the jury, find the defendant, Mark Jensen, guilty of murder in the first degree. Gasps filled the room. Megan cried openly. Detective Whitmore closed her eyes. And Mark? He just sat still, expressionless, as if he'd known this moment was inevitable. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. No one applauded. No one spoke. The gavel came down like a thunderclap. Outside, rain began to fall. Reporters stood under umbrellas recounting the verdict live. Justice for Laura, the headlines read. But justice felt hollow. The truth had come out, yes, but at the cost of a life, a family, a child's innocence. Weeks later, at the school where Laura once taught, her colleagues held a memorial. Children placed drawings and flowers under her photo. The principal read a letter found in Laura's desk. Never finished, never sent. You can't protect people by keeping them quiet, it read. Sometimes protection means telling the truth even when it hurts. That letter became her final message, one that echoed far beyond the classroom walls. Mark sat alone in his prison cell, the walls closing in. The man who once commanded authority now lived in silence, haunted by the woman whose voice had brought him down. Every night when the lights went out, he could still hear her last words in his mind. Maybe not the real ones, but the ones he knew she would have said if she'd had the chance. You can't protect what you destroy. Back in Willow Creek, the town slowly tried to heal. The sheriff's department held a ceremony retiring Mark's badge, locking it away in evidence forever. Detective Whitmore stood outside the courthouse steps after the sentencing, looking at the sky heavy with clouds. She tried to tell us, she murmured. We just didn't listen soon enough. And inside a small home at the edge of town, Ethan kept a photo of his mother by his bedside. Each night he whispered goodnight to her picture. Some nights he dreamed of her voice, soft and gentle, telling him everything would be okay. But even as time passed, Willow Creek never forgot. The story of Laura and Mark Jensen became a quiet warning whispered in homes and classrooms. Even those sworn to protect can sometimes be the ones who cause the most harm. The verdict had been delivered. The courtroom had emptied. But in Willow Creek, the echo of Laura Jensen's death lingered in every quiet corner of the town. The story was over, yet the pain remained, raw, unspoken, and unforgettable. In the weeks after the trial, the small town began its slow attempt at healing. The sheriff's department removed Mark's photograph from the wall of honor, the frame leaving behind a faint outline, a ghostly reminder of the man they thought they knew. His name was erased from the duty roster, his badge locked away as evidence, never to be worn again. But no matter how much the town tried to erase his presence, the memory of what he'd done stayed like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed out. Detective Whitmore carried the case like a weight she couldn't set down. She'd worked dozens of investigations, seen the darkest sides of humanity, but this one was different. Mark had been one of their own. She remembered the first day she met him, his confidence, his politeness, his firm handshake. Now she couldn't stop replaying the photos from the crime scene, the recordings of Laura's voice, and the look on Ethan S.'s face when he was told his father might be coming home. Some nights Whitmore would drive past the Jensen house. The yard was overgrown now. The blinds were still drawn. A for sale sign leaned crookedly in the front yard, rain washing over it. No one wanted to live there, not after what happened. Some said they still saw lights flickering inside late at night, though the house had been empty for months. Maybe it was just the neighbor's imagination, or maybe it was something else. The echo of a family that once was. Laura's memorial at the elementary school became a place of quiet pilgrimage. A framed photo of her stood in the hallway, surrounded by notes from her students. "We miss you, Miss Jensen. You were the best teacher. Thank you for making me brave." Her influence lived on in the little hearts she had shaped, a reminder that even in tragedy, love leaves a trace that violence can't erase. Her best friend Megan started a local awareness foundation in her memory, the Laura Jensen Project, dedicated to helping victims of domestic abuse find safety before it's too late. She gave interviews, spoke to schools, and met with police departments to push for reform. "We can't let another woman's voice go unheard," she said in one speech. If Laura had been truly protected, if someone had listened sooner, maybe she'd still be here. Ethan, now living with Laura's sister, was adjusting slowly. He didn't understand all the words adults used: custody, trauma, therapy, justice. But he understood one thing. His mom loved him more than anything. He kept a small locket around his neck with her picture inside. Every night before bed, he would whisper the same words. "Good night, Mom. I'm brave like you now." For those who knew Mark, the disbelief never fully faded. They replayed every smile, every laugh, every handshake, searching for the signs they missed. Some blamed themselves for not seeing the truth sooner. Others simply avoided talking about it altogether. But silence had been the very thing that killed Laura. And silence this time would not win. Months later, a local journalist released a special report titled "The Deputy Who Hid His Darkness." It explored how domestic violence can hide behind power, how manipulation can wear the face of authority. It wasn't just Laura's story anymore. It was a story that belonged to thousands of others who were still trapped, still afraid, still unseen. The episode ended with a haunting quote from one of Laura's letters. "Monsters don't always come from the dark. Sometimes they wear the same uniform we trust." The story reached millions online. It sparked conversations, reform, and awareness campaigns across the country. Police departments began implementing mandatory counseling programs and stricter checks for domestic complaints involving officers. Laura's voice, silenced in life, had become a catalyst for change in death. And yet, beyond all the headlines, all the speeches, there was something quieter and deeper. A lesson. That love is not control. That protection is not possession. That no title, no badge, no uniform gives someone the right to take away another person's safety, freedom, or life. Detective Whitmore visited Laura's grave on the anniversary of her death. She placed a white lily down, her hand trembling slightly. "You were right," she whispered. "We should have listened sooner, but I promise we're listening now." The camera, if this were a film, would linger there. The wind moving through the grass, the town silent under a gray sky. Then it would cut to the empty street, the faded for sale sign swaying, the echo of a child's laughter somewhere in the distance. Life goes on, but never the same. Laura Jensen's story is more than just a tragedy. It's a warning and a call to awareness. If you or someone you know is living in fear, don't wait. Don't stay silent. Speak up. Help is out there. Because silence protects the abuser, not the victim. And the bravest thing you can do is ask for help before it's too late. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share Laura's story. Someone out there needs to hear it tonight. Comment "Justice for Laura" to honor victims of domestic abuse. And if you or someone you love is in danger, please reach out. National Domestic Violence Hotline 1-800-799-SAFE-7233. Your voice matters. Your story matters. You are not alone.